Hello everybody and welcome back. Today I'm making art dolls of Scott, Shelby, Owen and Pyro from VampireSMP. For those who haven't seen VampireSMP, it's basically a Minecraft roleplay series where 14 creators find themselves stranded together, but secretly 2 of them are vampires, whose goal it is to turn the rest of the humans. Since the vampires can transform into bats, I thought it'd be fun to make all 5 characters in their bat forms. So let's get started. We'll start with Scott first. Between the fancy outfits, dramatic entrances, and general flair for theatrics, he was always going to be first. As always, I started with a tinfoil core and covered it with clay. For the paint job, I went with a grey with a slight blue hint. For all these dolls, I've decided to base the colours more on the character's original appearance rather than their final vampire form. Also, if you're wondering why my setup looks different, that's because this was filmed during a heatwave. My studio was absolutely sweltering, so I ended up moving everything into my living room where the air conditioning was. Unfortunately, my extension lead didn't quite reach the coffee table, which meant every time I needed the hot glue gun, I had to sit on the floor halfway across the room. Meanwhile, my dog had absolutely no awareness of the boiling hot glue and kept trying to wander through my workspace. I also ended up changing the earrings. I have a small collection of costume jewellery that I can't wear, so it's perfect for projects like this. The wings took a bit of trial and error. I couldn't figure out how I wanted to make them at first, so I ended up just watching a tutorial. And after a lot of experimenting, we finally got there. And of course, I had to add Scott's signature ruffled neck piece and gem to finish the look. Next we have Owen. For some reason, this one ended up being far more difficult to make. This was actually my 3rd attempt at sculpting him, and to this day, I couldn't tell you exactly why he was so much harder than everyone else. The first 2 attempts just didn't look right, Sometimes with art projects, there's a very obvious problem you can fix, but with this one everything just looked off. Eventually, after a lot of trial and error, I finally got a face I was happy with and could start adding the details. For the paint, I started with a light brown base before going over it with a dark dry brush. It added a lot more depth to the face and stopped everything from looking too flat. I originally painted the nose black as well, but later changed it to brown because it fitted the colour palette much better. For the fur, I actually used parts of an old faux fur coat I found in a charity shop. The coat itself was pretty damaged, but it worked perfectly for this project. Once the fur was attached, it was time to tackle the wings. While researching designs for the doll, I came across this really cool piece of fan art that showed the character with ripped, tattered wings, so I decided to incorporate that in my design. Next we have Shelby. While sculpting this one, I actually rediscovered a long lost clay tool that just so happened to be one of my favourites. Naturally, I started finding every possible excuse to use it. It turned out especially useful around the eyes, where I needed to blend the clay smoothly into the rest of the face. Honestly, finding that tool again was probably one of the highlights of the entire project. For the paint, I tried to match the head colour to the fur as closely as possible. I was using the same fabric that I used for Owen. Whoever owned that coat before me must have been very generous with their perfume, because both Owen and Shelby have ended up smelling strongly of flowers. Not exactly the scent I associate with vampires, but we can roll with this. Once the paint was finished and the eyes were glazed, I decided to try something completely new for me: eyelashes. I actually bought some fake eyelashes for a previous project, forgot they existed, and never used them, so I figured Shelby was the perfect opportunity to give them a go. At the time, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. There was a lot of guesswork involved, but somehow it worked, and that's good enough for me. If it works, it works. After that, I moved on to the fur, ears, and all the other little details. One thing I really wanted to include was Shelby's long maroon hair. Obviously that was a bit difficult when you're making bats, so I had to get creative. In the end, I decided just to dye the fur around the head instead. At first, I was convinced I had completely ruined it. It was one of those moments where you look at the project and immediately think, oh gosh, what have I done? But after a few different shades of red and blending everything together, I actually ended up really liking the effect. Although I have to admit, it does slightly look like Shelby had just walked away from a crime scene, which, considering we're making vampires, feels oddly appropriate. And lastly we have Jack von Pyro Scythe, or just Pyro. I think that's how you pronounce it. For some reason this one ended up much smaller than I originally intended. I don't know exactly when this happened, but somewhere along the way this one became significantly more compact than the rest of the bats. Once the sculpting was finished, I painted them in a similar colour palette to Scott. Since they're both vampires, I wanted them to feel like they belonged in the same collection, while they still having their own distinct designs. Then came the ears and wings. By this point, I'd finally worked out a system for making the wings. At the start of the project, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, but after making several bats, I've become slightly more competent. My highly professional technique involved drawing a rough shape around the wireframe with a Sharpie and hoping for the best. As I said, highly professional. The part I was most unsure about was the cloak. I knew I wanted Pyro to have one, but I didn't really have a plan beyond that, so I started just cutting fabric, folding things and generally making it up as I went along. Somehow it all came together into a short cloak with a high collar, which felt very fitting for a dramatic vampire. To decorate it, I glued part of a pearl necklace onto the front and added a red trim using a marker pen. Honestly, I wasn't entirely convinced while I was making it, but once everything was assembled, it ended up being one of my favourite outfits from the entire project.